Good morning, everyone. Could you people just take their seats, please? We'll begin our ceremonies in just a moment. If you're not sure of your seats, then the staff will be able to help you to your seats. I'd now like to invite Terry to garland our keynote speaker. Thank you very much, Terry. Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all for the University's Learning Teaching Forum for 2019 here at Laucala Campus. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Richard Cole. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education. A warm welcome also to our viewers tuned in from the regional campuses through our live streaming on the University website. I'd first like to acknowledge and thank our keynote speaker, Professor Russell Bishop, and his wife, Rowan, and thank them for travelling to Fiji to be with us today. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge all SMT members who are present today, staff, students, and a particular warm welcome to our campus directors who are here for the Campus Directors Forum and who have come to join us today at the Learning Teaching Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, this theme for this year's forum is the best possible outcome for all learners. This theme is intended to help the university focus on how we can ensure our provision of education provides for the best outcomes for all of our students, irrespective of their ethnicity, socioeconomic status, any disabilities, their location, and any other variables. This theme was chosen to be deliberately broad rather than a term like inclusive education or equity in education, which are similar but related themes. We wanted to be broader. We also wanted to be outcomes focused rather than focused on the process of education. And it's about the access and lifting the performance of all our learners, helping to achieve the maximum that they themselves can rather than lifting performance in some more general fashion. As you'll recall, those who have been to our forums in the past, then we take the opportunity to acknowledge the teaching excellence of the university. The university runs Teaching Excellence Awards across all faculties and at TAFE College, and each winner of that award is then eligible for the Vice-Chancellor's Prize. So today I will formally announce the Faculty Teaching Excellence Award winners for 2019, and I'll also announce the winner of the university-wide Vice-Chancellor's Teaching Excellence Award. I'll invite our keynote speaker, Professor Bishop, to present the plaques to the winners. Professor Bishop, if you just perhaps come here. Each faculty winner was nominated by a minimum of 5 students or colleagues and then asked to prepare a portfolio based on the following criteria. Approaches to teaching that influence, motivate and inspire students to learn. Development of curricula and resources that reflect a command of the field. Approaches to assessment and feedback that foster independent learning. Respect and support for the development of students as individuals, and finally, scholarly activities that influence and enhance learning and teaching. I'll now announce the winners for each of the faculties in turn and then the overall winner. From the Faculty in Business and Economics, the Teaching Excellence Award goes to Jope Tarai. Faculty of Arts, Law and Education Teaching Excellence Award goes to Fiona Willens. The Faculty of Science, Technology and Environment Teaching Excellence Award goes to Uktau Meta. Pacific Technical and Further Education College Teaching Excellence Award goes to Zena Sharani. The Vice-Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching for 2019 goes to Zena Sharani. Prof. Bishop, may I take your seat again? Thanks. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to warmly acknowledge the great effort of all of our faculty and TAFE Excellence Award winners and our overall winner. It's very clear from the portfolios that a panel evaluated how dedicated these people are and how a great example they are to their colleagues and to the students. And it's what the university is all about, is striving for excellence in everything we do, but particularly in education. So can we have another round of applause for our winners? Thank you. One of the benefits of winning the award is you get to present at the forum. So I'm not sure they would see it as a benefit necessarily, but so we'll be hearing from our award winners later in the program, and our intention here was to have our best teachers for the year present to us on what they've done and how they have drawn upon with their knowledge and the expertise and experience. And what we've done different this year from previous years, we've also asked them to bring a student along so we can see both sides of the equation here, the teacher and the learner as well. So we'll have that in the later part of the program. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Russell Bishop. Professor Bishop is Emeritus Professor of Maori Education, the Faculty of Education at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. He's well known for directing the development of Tikatanga, a large New Zealand Ministry of Education funded research and professional development project which ran from 2001 into 2012. This project demonstrated how teachers and other school leaders could improve the education achievement of Maori students in mainstream classrooms by implementing a culturally responsive pedagogy of relations. Since his retirement from Waikato University, he has developed the notion of relational pedagogy and leadership further with cognition education in New Zealand, Australia and Canada. Professor Bishop is the author of 9 books and over 90 other quality-assured publications. He's delivered over 100 keynote addresses nationally and internationally, and has attracted more than New Zealand $32.5 million in research and development contract funding in recent years. He's won numerous awards for his work, including he was recently awarded the Order of New Zealand Merit. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very privileged to have a man of Professor Bishop's stature with here today, and I'm sure, like me, you look forward to hearing what he has to say. I'll now invite Professor Bishop to give his keynote address for the forum. Thank you.
Be positive. Put it on the trousers, okay. Okay, how's that? Now you got that clicker, brilliant. Right, kia ora. Tēnā koutou. Nā minu kia koutou, e te ata nei nō reira tēnā koutou hoki ana ki tō mihi whakamahana ki ahau e te ata nō reira tēnā koe. Tēnā koe te rangatira. E o koutou mā, hui mai I rau te korowai o tātou ariki, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Pirenga hau ki te whakamaro ko whakaaro mai te kaupapa I konei, mua koutou, nā te mea he kaupapa ko tata ki toko manawa. Ngā iwa konei, tēnā koutou. Te whenua konei, tēnā koe. Hono e hau kei te tū, mua o whenua. I mua o koutou iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā tātou koutou. Hoki ana ki tō tātou tēne aitua, tēne mate. Haere, haere, haere. Mihi ana ki a rātou. Yo koutou mā, tēnā koutou. Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Okay, that's good. I forgot what I'm going to talk about now, but no, I haven't. I was just teasing, just to make sure you're awake there, just checking. There'll be a test afterwards, by the way. I think this is a great topic. I've just got some notes here I want to start with because I want to link it into what Professor Coles was just saying before, that we're talking here about improving the educational outcomes and the educational engagement of your students in this institution, of our students in institutions in New Zealand. I want to emphasise that what I'm talking about has been developed in secondary schools, trialled in primary schools, and also in tertiary institutions. Not so much in universities, but at one particular polytech in New Zealand, UCOL in Palmerston North. And the program that I'm going to be talking about today, in fact, the model that I'm talking to you about, was used at this polytechnic, a tertiary institution. And the aim that they had was to improve the engagement of Māori students in their institution. And by doing that, they were able to improve the whole engagement of their students, and so much so that they moved their institution from 16 out of 16 in terms of completions to 6 out of 16 in terms of the rankings of the polytechnics in New Zealand. So although what I'm talking about today is based in secondary schooling, as Professor Coles identified, I ran a program and developed a program which ran in secondary schools in New Zealand. Oops. And it's also been worked in primary schools here in Australia and Canada as well, but also it's been working in tertiary institutions. So I hope there's messages in here that you will take away that are useful, that make sense. So as I'm saying here, the trend that we're looking at is the movement away from knowledge as something to be passed on by a lecturer standing at the front of a room like I'm doing now, ironically, and is to being towards the movement towards co-creating knowledge with others and moving towards what is known as a discursive approach to knowledge creation. That is, where young people and students are actually learning to be part of the process of learning and learning what it is to become a learner. So learning the discourses of subjects as opposed to being recipients of knowledge, the old empty vessel syndrome. So we're part of that movement, and I know you're very much part of that movement in USP. But that movement away from knowledge transmission towards knowledge creation is what I'm talking about, and I want to fit my work into that frame. However, what I want to start off with as a warning is that most people, certainly many people, who start on this movement from the knowledge transmission to knowledge creation, most people that do that tend to see what you've got to do is actually change the way that you interact with people and move towards a dialogic, interactive mode of educating. However, what I want to say today is that for students that you'll be dealing with, like the students that I've been dealing with in New Zealand, and Aboriginal students in Australia, and Indigenous students in North America, for these young people, that is actually an insufficient situation. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. The sufficient condition is, in fact, taking a step beyond that, and looking, so what base can we develop upon which we can develop dialogic interactive modes of teaching? And the base on which we're talking about is actually a relational base. So what I want to talk about initially is the importance and the necessity for being able to develop caring and learning relationships with young people, and to be able to create a caring and learning context for learning within your learning spaces. So and I will show you some empirical evidence for why this is necessary. And then I will develop from that the notion, this is where you can now then start to be using dialogic interactive teaching modes. And then I will finish it off by showing you how to sustain this in your institution. Because that was one of the big lessons that I learned out of Te Kotaitanga, was how difficult it is to sustain education reform. So briefly, we're in a process of education reform, moving from old-style transmission modes to interactive creating knowledge modes, into discursive modes of pedagogy. And we're looking at this being an interactive mode. Moving straight to that, though, is difficult. There is a major step that is needed on the way, and that is learning how to develop relationships and to create context for learning wherein those dialogic interactive pedagogies can be used most effectively. If you've got any questions as we're going through, I should also ask you to make sure that you write them down, or if you've got a good generic question, please ask. Don't feel you have to sit there and let something go by. But don't make it too difficult, okay? Make it easy. I only answer easy questions, all right? I don't answer difficult questions. And look, I forgot to also say hello when I was saying hello to all of you people. I forgot to say hello to those people at the other ends of the cameras, because that's all the rest of the Pacific Islands, isn't it? So, kia ora no tātou i a koutou ngā memo o te whānau hoi hoi mai i enei motu o Mananui a Kiwa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora, kia koutou. Okay, so we're talking about teaching to the northeast. I'm not talking about teaching in Tavauni it's a metaphor, right? I'm talking about, and I'll get to that in a minute. All right, away we go. One of our best reporters in the New Zealand Herald wrote this last year, and I thought it was good to see how it's becoming part of the daily discourse. That we are an acknowledgement that we are in fact social creatures, and that we need to connect with other people, and we are made, we are created, we are constructed or co-constructed through our relationships. It's absolutely vital, and this is one thing that often we forget. I'm making a case now for relationship-based learning. I'm making a case now for relationships to be fundamental to our teaching. I'm also going to make a case that relationships are not on their own enough. You've got to be very careful that we don't just focus on relationships, and what we do then is we end up with happy students, but we don't end up with achieving students. So we've got to have both. We've got to have happy and achieving students. And another thing that we need to understand is that our mental health and our well-being is in fact co-created through our relationships. This is part of the argument that I'm making. Now, what I've got here is a book that Mary Berryman and I wrote in 2005, based upon the interviews that we undertook with large numbers of Māori students, their families, their school teachers and their school principals earlier in that decade, when we asked them, so what's it like to be a Māori student in secondary schools? And they basically told us that it was a lousy experience they were having. And I wonder how often we ask our students in our tertiary institutions, not just on a reform at the end of our lectures or the end of our classes, where they do a sort of a small quantitative exercise, but do we actually get into a detailed qualitative exercise where we do semi-structured interviews or in-depth interviews with young people and say, what's it actually like to be a student in this institution? What's it actually like for you as a person, as a learner in this institution? I was at Auckland University recently, and they're in the Faculty of Arts, and they were telling me they've just started doing this in their institution, and they've found to their dismay that most of their Māori students and Pacifica students are finding they're having a lousy experience. They didn't know that before because I'd never spoken to them about it. And they also found that their Pākehā students, the ones who had come out of the top schools in Auckland and they thought would be going really well, they were also having a lousy experience. And they found that the one word that kept coming up was disconnection. They were disconnected. There was a disconnection between them and their teachers. In other words, there was no relationship. And when we spoke to the Māori students, they said that negative, toxic relationships were in fact the norm in schools. And I really want to emphasise how important this is. This is what they were saying. And when we did a frequency count of the unit ideas that they were using, we identified that of 3 discourses that people drew upon to explain their experiences, when we asked the question, what has the biggest influence upon your educational outcomes? And they were identified by these discourses. They drew upon these 3 discourses to explain their experiences. They said it was either themselves or the students, or it was the structure of the school, of the system, or the relationships between the teachers and themselves, or the families and the schools, and so on. And what the students said was, in fact, the biggest influence upon their educational outcome were the relationships they had with their educators, with their teachers. And they said, if we go to maths, it's because we like the teacher, it's not because we like maths. Well, you know that. We know that. We know that often many of us who end up in various positions in education got there because of significant teachers in our history. It wasn't the fact that we loved equationing or whatever it was, but we really got on with the teachers very well. We had a great relationship with them. I mean, I can remember the teachers who got me, who pushed me in the direction that I went in. What did their parents say? Parents said the same thing. They said the quality of the relationships that we have with the school or that our children have with their teachers has the biggest impact upon their educational achievement outcomes. This is really important stuff. And the school principals also said the same thing. They went on and on about, providing the right facilities and the structures of the institution, all that sort of stuff. And then we said to them, okay, right at the very end of everything though, what's the most important thing that's having an impact upon your children? And they said relationships. And particularly the deputy principals, they knew, because they were the ones who had to pick up the results of relationship breakdown. Then we asked the teachers. What did they say? They said it was the kids. And they said that it was so bad, the children were so bad and so naughty, these Māori kids, that they couldn't actually do anything about it. They came to school with so many problems that they couldn't do anything about it. And they felt frustrated, angry, upset. And they said to us, so what can we do about it? Can you help us? And we said, well, I'm glad you brought that up. We've got a few ideas on how to do it. But first of all, you've got to have a look at this stuff. And this is really important. If you find this stuff in your institution, you're going to be blank wall, brick wall. You're going to find, you're never going to make any progress. I'll give you some example. This is called deficit thinking. Most of the teachers that we spoke to back in 2000, and this is start of the 2000s, this is blooming near 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone away. It's gone a bit underground, I think. But still, when you scratch the surface and you ask people, so what's holding Māori kids back? Because see, the stats of disparity in New Zealand haven't really changed. They're still too far apart. And what we hear is this business of, oh, well, they don't really do enough. I'll show you what it looks like. This is a record that I made of a group of teachers talking about their one class. All of these teachers shared a class. The class had a lot of Maori kids in it. And when I asked these teachers, how are the kids getting on? This is what they told me. I wrote it down verbatim, and then I went and had a cup of tea to get over it. Have a read of this. We'll never see any excellence in this class. Now, you know from your textbooks that one of the key drivers of making a difference for educational outcomes is having high expectations. Now, if you think like that, you're doomed. And if any of your educators think like that, they are doomed to failure and to feeling dejected, rejected, and upset. This is the real key stuff that you've got to identify, not by going out and saying, oh, you're a bunch of racists. That doesn't get you very far, I've found. What does make a difference is that if people are saying this, it's actually allowing them to revisit what they're saying and critically reflect upon the impact that this will have upon their relationships with their students. And they will do that if you actually provide them with a narrative of what they've been saying. We had numbers of people do this in schools. And in fact, I've done this with lots and lots of school staff and actually just recorded what they said, and then a week or so later give it back to them and they will say, who said this? This is racist rubbish. And I've just politely pointed out to them that's what they said that. And they said, oh, okay, this is not good enough. We need to change. It's cool. They bring about the change themselves. So it doesn't, I'm repeating this again. Please, don't go up to anybody and say it's your fault. You're the one that's causing the problem. Because all you'll get is a poke in the eye. You don't need that. What you need is collaboration and cooperation. And you can do it through a narrative approach. They're not motivated and as a result do not achieve. I like my students pre-motivated. I don't need to motivate them is what they were saying. No, I'm serious. This is what teachers told me. They need to have the language of the subject. What do we do if they don't have it? Well, I would have said teach it. But that was a little simple, eh? Teacher 2 said, when they come to class, if they don't like the lesson, they switch off. They don't like each other, group work does not work. Well, it does. But if you don't think it will, it won't. If they miss a class, what can I do? They're just not motivated to learn. Our structures are not adequate. We need a better system where we have academic schools, technical schools. Man, I come up through that system. We had to get rid of that system to get over that sort of denial of educational opportunities to working class people. I'm losing control of my year 9s. What can you do? And then the no motivation. It's all the problem. It's all their problem. And then the final one, send them to the Maori teachers. They'll know what to do. I'm a big fan that every teacher in a school is a teacher of all students. and is responsible for all students. I'll give you a good example of deficit thinking and how it impacts your ability to do anything in a school, anything in a classroom. If you want to be a dialogic, interactive teacher, like these young folk are over here, because you don't get awards unless you are in that category. But you see, you've probably got, I would suggest in the institution, you've probably got a few stars like you've got over here, but what you really need to be able to do is make that systematically part of the system. It's got to be systemic. The ability that these young people have got who have got these awards, you've got to somehow package it and make it so that everybody can do that. It's got to become the norm. I'm sorry, but you've got to become average. You know? And when these folk become average, you're going to have a different institution. I'll give you an example of deficit thinking. Rowan, my wife, who's in the front row, and is an expert horse person. Now, well, you think, what the hell has this got to do with the price of fish? I'll get there though, don't worry. Well, about 2 years ago, Rowan and I did a walk in Spain, and we walked across the Camino de Santiago. And it was a long way. And at one point we got to a hill, and it was 9 kilometres up the hill. And at the bottom of the hill was a very entrepreneurial Spanish person who had a bunch of horses and had a big sign saying, "Don't walk up the hill, get on the back of the horse." Well, she's a gun horse rider, and she gets up on the horse and she walks up to the horse and she says, "How do you do?" And the horse says, "Good morning." And Rowan says, "I know what I'm doing. You can be confident in my hands. I've got high expectations of you. I will look after you, and I know that you're a good horse and you'll get up the hill." And the horse replied to her, "That is very nice to see you here. I know that you will care for me. I know you've got high expectations of it. And most of all, I know that you know what you're doing. And I feel confident with you." And therefore, she was enabled to do the very thing that she was supposed to do there, was to get on the back of the horse and ride it up this 9-kilometre hill. Her husband, on the other hand, is not a very confident horse rider. And he goes up to the first horse and says, "You don't look very good. You look like a bit of one of the reject horses, and I think I've got a reject horse, and I didn't." And the horse looked at me and said, "Well, you don't know what to do you? You look particularly useless, in fact. So what I'll do is that I won't even let you get on my back. In fact, I might even bite you. And if you turn around behind me, I'm going to kick you. I'm going to sort you out, mate. You're useless." And so I went to the people and I said, "Well, I think you've given me a dud horse. There is something wrong with your horse. I want my money back." And they said, "No, you don't get your money back because there's nothing wrong with the horse. He's perfectly capable." So I did my dough on that job. It was a bit of a fizzer. But then on close reflection, it turned out that in fact, the horse was exactly the same as the horse that Rowan got on, that she was able to ride up the hill. And I wasn't able to do it because there was something wrong there. And it was actually with me. My attitude to the horse did not allow me to do the next activity. I can give you lots of examples of deficit thinking, but I'm sure you know what I mean. If people are not able to interact and relate with people in a caring way so that young people know that they are caring for their education, then things don't work very well. You are not enabled to do the next bit of your job. So the solutions, what are we looking for in here in terms of solutions? An overall solution is looking at what Sir Michael Caine said this last year. I was really taken by it, and I thought this is becoming really common in the discourse, in the international, in the common, local discourse, that the family is the most important organisation in the world for generating relationships. And I'd written this in 1999, for goodness sake. I was delighted to hear that it had actually become part of the common discourse of the society, if you like, where I'd suggested in 1999 in this book, Culture Counts, that teaching in Māori settings is in fact a matter of establishing extended family-like relationships. So if you want to use that metaphor, and this I would suggest is a common metaphor for the Pacific, is that the central organising institution of young people's lives is the family. It's where they learn to be who they are. It's the relationships that they develop. It's where they are cared for. It's where they learn. It's where they are learning with a significant other who understands and knows who they are and what they need to learn. Somebody who actually takes responsibility for their learning. Somebody becomes a leader of their learning. It's a really very powerful metaphor that we can use in our educational settings. And in fact, what I then developed as a basis of the program Te Koteitanga was this idea that relationships, as you get better along the bottom of this graph, allows you to engage in interactions and allows you to head to the northeast of the graph. I'm just putting a compass bearing onto this scatter plot. So the theory, if you like, the hypothesis behind Te Koteitanga was an idea that as you get better at relationships, you will be able to do the job of teaching. If I was able to have got better at the relationship I could have developed with that horse, I would have then been able to do the job of riding the horse. If teachers are better able to establish a relationship, they will be more able to do the job of teaching. And I'm suggesting that the relationship, the metaphor for the relationships that is appropriate to us in this setting is that of a family. And it's not so much the nuclear family, it's an extended family. It's the extended family of the grandparents, of the uncles and aunties. It's all those extended families that we live in, and that particularly your students will be living in. That is a metaphor for how we can model our education institutions. I'll give you an example. We were then able to gather a whole lot of data on how well this hypothesis went in institutions. And what we've gathered ages of teachers, different genders of teachers, different ethnicities of teachers. In other words, what you've got here is an enormous picture of diversity, of the response of diversity to this business of relationships and discursive interactions, dialogic interactions we're talking about. Because, why is it important that we move to dialogic interactions? Is because we know that these are the things that make a difference for learning. But as I said to you before, and you can see in this graph, is that if you don't attend to relationships first, you won't be able to engage in dialogic interactions. Now, if you have a look at this graph, you can see that along the bottom, the weighted relationship scale, can you see it all right? At the back? Can you see it? Okay. There was 2 people. What about the rest? Okay, all right, I hope you can see it. No pointer here, no. But anyway, along the bottom there, you've got a Likert scale measuring relationships, observable relationships in the classroom. In other words, it's a compendium, a compilation of are people establishing in their classrooms an extended family-like relationship which is characterised by them not using deficit language, by demonstrating they care for the students' learning, by demonstrating they've got high expectations, by knowing what they're doing, and demonstrating that they know how to do it. These things create a context for learning that is as if it were an extended family, because this is what extended families do for young people. And we're trying to take that model, that metaphor, and put it into our education institutions. On the vertical axis, you've got a measure of those dialogic, discursive interactions that we know make a difference for students' learning and that we want to promote. We want to move away from transmission modes of education, which we know don't improve learning. They're in fact, you can do this stuff, which I'm doing now, for about 8 minutes before most people turn off. So therefore I'll carry on. But you'll notice I took a break then, so that I've started another 8 minutes now, you see. So what you've got here is that you can see that there's a correlation between, as people get better at establishing relationships, going from left to right on the horizontal axis, to being able to use discursive interactions, that is, on the vertical axis. So there's a correlation. It's 0.4. It's not a very strong correlation, but I'll show you why in a minute. But what it does show is that as you get better at developing a relationship in your classroom, you are more likely to be using those effective pedagogies that we know make a difference for people's learning. However, have a look at the upper left-hand quadrant, the upper left-hand corner. What's fascinating about that is there is not one observation in that category. That is, low level of relationships and high level of dialogic interactions. I think this is one of the most important graphs that comes out of Te Koteitanga. It took us years to get this information, but I think it's one of the most important bits of data that you can use, that we can ever show you. And that is, if you don't develop and establish an effective learning relationship, the bottom line, you are not going to be using, and I would suggest not able to use, those pedagogies that we know make a difference. So I would suggest that those folk that you have just awarded these awards to will be very high on the horizontal axis as well as on the vertical axis. They'll be up there in the northeast. I'd suggest that you've got a bunch of northeast teachers here, and you've rewarded these northeast teachers. And this is who you want in your institution. You want northeast teachers. You don't want northwest teachers. You don't want southeast teachers. And you certainly don't want, southwest teachers. Now, when we had a look at what's the probability of this happening, and we did a probability analysis of it, and what's fascinating about it is that the probability of it happening is exponential. It's not arithmetic. It's 2, 4, 8, 16. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It means that as people get better at implementing, of developing or creating an extended family-like context in their classroom, they're actually more able to use those pedagogies we know make a difference for learning. And what's fascinating about it is that it's therefore the relationship is the base for the other, for the discursive interactions. So it says that you need, if you want to improve your teaching, you've got to develop a relationship. And if you do, you'll get better at an increasing rate. So in other words, those teachers that are the northeast teachers are way better than anybody else you've got. Now, the next one is another graph which shows student engagement. And this is the other thing you're trying to do in this institution, is to improve the engagement of young people with learning, of students with learning. And here again, there's a correlation. Better relationships, better student engagement. And again, there's a gap in the upper left-hand corner, But interestingly enough, there's a gap in the bottom right-hand corner here too, which shows that those people who have high levels of relationships in their classrooms have virtually nobody not engaged. Everybody's engaged in their learning. People want to go to these classrooms. They want to get there because these people know how to create a situation where they can become effective learners. And again, it's an exponential growth. If you want to, in other words, you want to improve engagement, first of all, don't look at the pedagogy, look at the relationship. Because the relationship allows you to do the job of teaching. If you don't establish a relationship, you won't be able to do the job of teaching. Now that, I suggest to you, is a really useful bit of information. In other words, if you want to get on the horse, let the horse know that you care for it, that you're not going to kick it, and he's certainly not going to kick you. And that you know what you're doing and you know how to do it. And above all, you don't say, it's your silly fault for my not being able to ride you. It's not the dog, not the horse's fault. And in fact, it's probably not your fault either. It's the relationship. It's the fault of the relationship. So you've got to fix up the relationship. Does that make a difference for achievement? Well, here again, this shows you, as you improve the relationship, this is mathematics. And you can see the red graph, the red lines are for Māori students and the grey lines are for non-Māori students. And what's marvellous about this is that everybody goes up. Now, when we spoke to students, we said, and they said, oh, we know that stuff already, because they'd told us 10 years prior. But then we did an analysis of what they said in terms of this crosshatch. And we said, there are in fact, these teachers, they told us, there are teachers that have low levels of relationships and low teaching skills. We don't want those teachers. We don't learn with those teachers. The bottom right-hand corner, we've got the high relationships but low teaching skills. Now watch out for those teachers because they're nice to you but they don't teach you properly. And then you've got the upper left-hand quadrant, you've got low relationships and high teaching skills. And I said to the Māori kids I was talking to, I said, do you get those kids? And they said, yeah, we get a lot of teachers that are really good at these interactive pedagogies, but they don't care for us. We don't think they like us. And then they said, the only teachers who we learn with are these fellows here. These people in the upper right-hand quadrant, the northeast, where they have high levels of relationship skills and they also know and practice interactive dialogic teaching practices. So the kids know this stuff. That's why I'm saying to you at the start, talk to your students. Find out what it's like to be, ask them, what's it like to be a student in this class? Don't say fill out a quantitative form and give me a mark on a Likert scale. Talk to them. So, hang on, where am I going? Right, all right. Well, this is also published in a flash journal, just in case you think I'm making it up. See, that's a flash journal, that one. You don't get any flasher than that. Well, you do, but not much. Okay, next question then. Righto, so we've got this sorted out. We know that to establish a family-like relationship, an extended family-like relationship is important for enabling us to ride the horse, to be able to do the job of teaching. And doing the job of teaching is using those things we know make a difference. And these things that we know make a difference is using prior knowledge of the student. What do you know about this stuff already? Giving people feedback, giving them feed forward, co-constructing knowledge, co-constructing learning. How together might we solve this problem? Doing things together. Collective efficacy has an effect size of 1.57. The highest effect size that John Hattie's found in all his 800,000 study of meta-analysis. The biggest thing that he's found that has the biggest impact upon student learning is collaborative work, collective efficacy. So we've got to be able to energise that. We've got to be able to get the energy of that and get it going. However, that's the summary of that bit. How are we going? What time do I finish? I'm fine, eh? Okay. Righto, the next bit is, so okay, how do you keep this going? One of the big problems we found when I went and had a look back at Te Koteitanga, after it had finished in 2012, and I was able to take a breather, I was able to have a look back at some of the data, and it looked at this stuff, and we found that there were some problems that may be relevant to you or not. I thought I'd raise them just in case they were. External funding. If you rely upon external funding to bring about change, when the external funding finishes, the program stops. Your reform process stops. So you've got to make the reform central to your institution, and you've got to use what's called hard money to do it, not soft money. So if in the Pacific, if you're relying upon aid to bring about the project, to bring about educational reform, when the aid finishes, you're in trouble. So it's got to be central money, centralised money. I learnt that one the hard way. I've learned all these things the hard way. Limited capacity building within the schools. If you rely upon outside experts and you don't build capacity within your institution to bring about change, then again, as soon as the money for those experts goes, the project goes. I was talking about UCOL before, the tertiary institution did so well. I was working with Cognition Education. We went in there and got it going, and then they developed this cohort of experts within their schools, within their institution, and that group drove the change. And they kept it going. We went along every now and then, did a bit of QA to make sure they were on the track, etc., give them a bit of a hand, and then they implemented the program. And it was from their own funds that they did this, not external funding. Very important. Another problem we made was that the model wasn't integrated sufficiently, but I won't go into that too much. But what I will do is go into is this business is that I'll show you what I mean. We go back to this graph again, and if we go back to this crosshatch, if you look at the lower right corner, what we managed to do was to convince people that relationships are really important, as I've just done with you, trying to convince you that relationships are central to be able to do the job of teaching. But what happens is that people got that message, and so they shifted from the southwest to the southeast. They didn't go to the northeast, they went to the southeast. And you know what students said about that? They said, we like these teachers because they're nice to us, they give us a feed, but they don't teach us properly. They don't use those pedagogic interactions we know make a difference. And so that was a major problem with Te Koteitanga. So what I'm suggesting now, as a different model, is that instead of that, you need that, you've got to have that basis to get to the northeast. But when you're in the northeast, you've got to have a means of knowing how well these things are going, so you've got to then monitor what's going in the northeast. You need that. You've then got to monitor what's going on in the northeast by looking at, are your learners able to do those things that make them into self-determining, self-regulating learners? So there are about 7 things that you need to monitor, and I'll go over those in a moment, to see if your relationships and your interactions are actually good enough. You need a means of finding out. And this, I would suggest, is the key to sustaining the project. So if you don't do this, your project will drift away. Your process of educational reform that you're trying to internalise into your institutions will drift off in some other direction. And it will become hijacked by the next thing that comes along. We are very prone to this in education, the next big thing that comes along. What I'm saying is there's a big trend here we're moving, as I said before, we're moving from transmission mode to collaborative, co-constructive mode, co-creating knowledge. Well, that's the big trend. If you're on it, keep on it. Don't get caught off into other things, but make sure that you're using this is a model that will help you sustain that particular approach. So, what I'm talking about now is a relationship-based. I've explained why it's a relationship-based, because the base allows us to do what we know makes a difference for learning. And it's because of that exponential growth, the probability of it taking place shows us that it's actually the base. It's not a one-to-one correlation. This is the foundation, the relationships. But remember though, relationships on their own are not enough. They're not sufficient. So what we're talking about is, and I'm also saying that instead of we're moving people, the whole movement from transmission, that is where you're a lecturer or a professor, where you profess, to being a collaborative co-constructor of learning, is that your job over here is moved from being a lecturer, professor type, to being a leader of learning. In this model, you are then responsible for the learning of other people. So you are leading their learning. And you're not only leading their learning of knowledge, you're leading their learning of the processes of knowledge. Remember, it's a discursive approach. We are inculcating people into the processes of learning, of what involves learning, what learning involves. We are getting people who are artists not to learn about the great masters, but to also understand the processes of becoming an artist. Scientists to be learning how to be scientists, not the recipients of people's previous scientists' work, and so on. So what's a leader look like? And a profile just means, what does it look like? If you went into a room with a group of people engaged in this sort of activity, what would they be doing? Here's what they're doing. The first thing they would be doing is that they would know how to create an extended family-like context for learning in their classrooms, in their schools, and I would suggest in a tertiary institution as well. I didn't update this enough, excuse me. Part two is they would then be able to, as a result of that, you would be able to see them interacting in ways that we know promote learning. And they would then monitor learners' progress and the impact of the process of learning, and they would be able to modify their relationships and modify their interactions accordingly, so they could sustain this growth. Of course, it helps to be supported in doing this. And another part of this whole model is coaching, is that you've actually got to support, you've got to develop within your institution an ongoing process of mentoring and coaching. Mentoring being a more overview, coaching being, okay, how do I develop this specific skill that is needed for this particular circumstance? And you need to be able to develop that in your institution. But you've got all these things in your institution. I've met people responsible for flexible learning. I've met people responsible for teaching and learning. Just in the 24 hours that I've been here, there's enough people here already doing this stuff. It's coordinating it around a common model. That is my suggestion. So what do each one of these consist of? Well, the first thing is creating an extended family-like context for learning. What do you do? What do people do to do this? The first thing is they reject deficit explanations for the inability of someone to learn. Somebody can't learn, it's not good enough to say, oh, they don't speak, their English is not good enough. Or their, what do you speak in the Marshall Islands? Marshallese. Their Marshallese is not good enough. Or my Marshallese is not good enough. It's not good enough to say that. Because, I mean, if the language is not good enough, then would you teach the language? You get it sorted, right? Easy to say, of course, but not, You've got to, it's the rejecting of deficit explanations. There's no point in saying, oh, because they are so-and-so. It's because they come from a particular group that they're characterised, their characteristics are such that they won't be able to enter into this sort of arrangement. They won't be able to take part in this sort of educational thing. That's rubbish. You know that's rubbish. We know it's rubbish, but we resort to that all the time. It's because the horse was a reject horse is the reason why I couldn't ride it. I still think I'm right. But in fact, tragically, there was nothing wrong with the horse. Tragically, there was something wrong with me. So when we come to these realizations, and you see, that's what makes us into professionals. That's what a professional is, a person who critically reflects upon their own assumptions, their own knowledge base, and then changes it. Don't expect that their patient or their client or their customer, you know, I mean, if we go into a shop and if somebody says to us, you say, well, I'd like to buy that suitcase, please. And they say, no, I don't think you'd be able to do that because you people from New Zealand, you wouldn't be able to carry that suitcase. It wouldn't look very good on you. What would you say to them? You'd say, what? What are you talking about? And if you went to a doctor and you said, look, I've got this bad cough, I want you to fix it. And they said, oh no, look, your sister came in here a couple of years ago and she had a bad cough too and it didn't get any better, so I'm not bothering treating you. Away you go. I know we laugh at this, don't we? But that's what teachers say to kids. They do. I bet you've heard it. You remember the start, I don't know if you've been in secondary schools lately, but there used to be dynamite situations where the teachers would get in there and talk about the kids and this was wrong with them and that's not. And I tell you what, a number of teachers told us that the staff room conversations change away from what's wrong with the kids to about how it will improve teaching and learning. And you know one of the things that really happens as a result of this is the teachers stay on the job. Do you know that we've got something like in New Zealand, 40% of our teachers leave within the first 5 years of being teachers after the teacher training business. 40%. Now I was talking to my wife's cousin. You feature quite a bit in this talk, don't you, really? Just as well you're here. I was talking to my wife's cousin the other day, who was an airline pilot, and he said, he used to fly for Air New Zealand, and he said, in Air New Zealand, if we had a 5% loss, we would say, holy heck, our system is absolutely crook. We've got a 40% loss in our education system in New Zealand. And yet we don't think the system's crook. We say it's the kids that are crook. It's crazy stuff. So if you don't reject deficit explanations, you might as well not go anywhere else. You might as well, give it away. The second thing is that kids have got to know you care for them. When we interview kids and we say, what's your favourite subject? They say, if they say maths or whatever they say, we say, how come that is? They say things like, in this subject, I know that we're going to succeed. Our teacher makes sure that we succeed. That's what's really important. They know that they're going to, and the teacher cares. They know the teacher cares. Not carey, lovey-dovey, but they care as educational professionals. That's what I mean by caring. I don't mean holding hands and singing Kumbaya. We're talking here about being educational professionals. This is what's involved. Not this business of saying, oh, these kids are no good. They can't do anything. High expectations, time and time again. Christine Ruby Davies has done tons and tons of studies on this. She did a wonderful study where she got, at the start of a year, she got a whole bunch of kids coming into intermediate school, and she talked to the teachers, and she said, "What are your expectations for these kids?" And they said, "Okay, well, in terms of achievement, they hadn't met the kids yet. They said the top will be the Asian kids, then there'll be the Pākehā kids, then there'll be the Maori kids, and then there'll be the Pacific Island kids. That'll be the achievement ranking." Christine did a study of the kids and she found that in fact they were all achieving about the same level. That's at the start of the year. At the end of the year, after a full year's teaching, she then went back and she tested the kids again, and you know what? They were like that now. The top kids were the Asians, the Pākehā kids were next, Maori kids were next, the Pacifica kids were following, were the lowest, achieving. Teacher expectations had created that situation. Managing learning effectively. How many people can't do that? Yet it's part of creating a family-like context for learning. You know, people that can run a good family know how to manage the family, know how to be effective in the family structures and stuff. Knowing what needs to be learnt. This is so vital. But notice that's where we put a tremendous amount of effort, but in fact it's only one of the first 5 characteristics. And yet at universities we put a tremendous amount of focus upon that. And we say this is probably the most important thing, you've got to know what you're talking about. Yes, but it's only part of what you need to know about. Okay, the second thing. Once you've got that sorted out, that will then enable you to do the next bit. And the next bit are these things. Are you able to, if you're able to create a family-like context, you will be able to draw upon learners' prior knowledge, because you will have an understanding that they do have prior knowledge that is important. See, deficit theorisers say that these kids don't know anything, and I'm here to tell them what they need to know. Are you able to use, you'll be able to use formative assessment, that is, provide feedback and feed forward. Again, Hattie's work shows us these have an effect size of 0.72, 0.4 being maturation, being an average. So 0.72 is like 2 years progress in every year by providing them this. And yet we know that most people get very little feedback on their educational progress, on how well they're doing. And yet we know it has this incredibly important thing. And we also know from Kath Irwin's studies that Māori kids get less feedback in classrooms than non-Māori kids. So the non-Māori kids get done all, but the Māori kids get even less. Using co-construction processes. When teachers are able to say, how together might we solve this problem, then they're actually able to make a major difference to the interactions that take place in the classroom. But you can only do that if you've got trust, respect, and a relationship built up where children know that you care for their learning. And then you're able to use power sharing strategies. For example, cooperative learning is one of the most fabulously useful strategies. I've seen it being used in Canada, I've seen it being used all over the place, and I've seen it, but also it needs to be built within a context, a structural context where others are supporting you in this whole process. Remember, it's very difficult to do things on your own. It's much easier to do this stuff with other people. Okay, now what is this monitoring all about I've been talking about? Monitoring how well your learners are able to do a number of things. Well, the first thing they've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to monitor their progress and the impact of learning processes, and this monitoring will help you sustain the levels of change that you're looking for in the institution, in your learning, in their learning, and in the whole institutional transformation from, well, as I said before, the transmission mode to the co-creating knowledge mode. From turning people to being recipients to being active learners. From supporting learners to becoming from passive recipients of knowledge to active co-constructors of knowledge. Those sort of transfers that you're engaging in now, I'm trying to give you a means of doing it. Right. So what do students have to be able to do so that they, A, can become self-regulating, self-determining learners, which is what Maori people are after. Indigenous people around the world are after becoming self-determining. So to being a self-determining learner, you can't just be self-determining because you get out of bed and say, I want to be self-determining today. You've actually got to learn the skills of it all. What do you have to do this? And then above all, how are you then, these skills are also those that make you employable in the world. It's an interesting book I was reading now a while ago, and a guy was on a plane, he was talking to the bloke next to him. The guy next to him ran a big chemical plant. And the bloke that was writing the book said, so what sort of skills do the people who get a job in your chemical plant, what sort of skills do they need? And he thought he would say, well, they need a PhD in chemistry, or they need to know physics, they've got to be good at maths. And the guy who was running the chemical plant didn't mention any of that stuff. He said, we take that for granted. We take content knowledge for granted. What the skills are is they've got to be able to set goals. They've got to be able to work with other people. They've got to be able to work in teams. They've got to be able to accept feedback. Do you know how difficult it is to learn how to accept feedback? Do you know how difficult it is to learn how to give feedback? Most people who get some feedback give our feedback back to the feedbacker. And it's often not very polite. It's take your feedback and put it somewhere. So, I even got confused there myself. Holy hell. How's the time? Oh, that's right, good. I have a horror of talking too long. And I bet you have too. Right, first thing, monitoring. Are your learners able to set goals for their own learning? Are you teaching them the skills of goal setting? Because goal setting is absolutely vital. If you can't learn how to set goals, you don't know where you're going. Well, you don't know when you get there. So goal setting is absolutely vital. And because of what it does is it takes this great plethora of information that we're living in and it does this to it. And it says, I only want to know that part. I'm following this pathway. It's like an aeroplane on autopilot. It's got to go down a certain pathway, otherwise it'll hit a mountain. We don't want to be doing that. Our education shouldn't be like that. Can they set goals? Can they articulate how they as learners prefer to learn? Do your students ever get a chance to articulate how they prefer to learn? Do you provide them with that opportunity? And are they able to identify how they best like to learn? Because if they can't, they won't ever know how they learn, how they are best to learn. And this does not mean that Pacifica people like to learn with playing a guitar. You know? Because that's what we get in New Zealand. We get, oh, Maoris are good at playing guitars, and they're good at singing, therefore we'll do a lot of that stuff. No, that's not the answer. Explain how they prefer to be organised in their learning. Are your learners able to explain how they best are able to be, how best they're organised? What's the best sort of organisation for their learning? Do you have these conversations with your learners? Are they able to take control and have some say in how they are organised? Are they able to participate? Are they able to participate in leadership roles and functions? Are they able to include others in their learning? In other words, can they work in teams? Can they work together? Can they provide feedback to other people? Can they get feedback? Can they have can they provide feed forward? Can they co-construct learning with others? Are they able to learn those skills that we know are what employers want in the future, or want now? Why should they have to learn those things when they leave the institution? Why should they have to draw together all the things, all the myriad of things that we're trying to teach in these institutions after they leave the institution? Are they able to provide evidence of how well they are progressing and what progress they are making? And most of all, can they identify where they need to go next with their learning? That's a self-determining, that's a self-regulating learner. Are we providing people with those opportunities in our everyday educational experiences, in their everyday educational experiences? In other words, are they able to take ownership of their learning? Are they able to become self-regulating, self-monitoring learners? That's the model. 3 parts to it. Are you able to create a family-like context in the classroom, in your learning spaces? Is that enabling you to then interact in ways we know make a difference for learners? And are you able to monitor what your learners are doing and how they're learning and the impact of the processes of learning upon them as learners? Are you a leader of learning, or are you still a dominant exponent of learning, of knowledge? And in those three parts, I'm suggesting will provide you with a sustainable model, movement of your institution from a transmission mode to a co-constructive, co-creating knowledge mode of education. One where people will leave this institution being self-regulating learners and, probably most importantly, effective citizens in a democracy. And there's the model. And there's the book that tells you all about it. So, nō reira, mā te ronga rawa koutou, e te aki e manaki. Kia ora o koutou kei te whakaronga ki a hau e tēnei wā. Nō reira, koutou mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Russell. I think it's absolutely wonderful talk and very, very interesting. Just a couple of quick comments. I love the analogy of the horse. Some of our own research has shown how potent analogies are, and I venture to say most people 12 months' time from now will remember the horse, and that will help link into the concepts and the ideas that Russell was so articulate about today as well. I particularly also like the notion of the concern about deficit teaching. I remember I've said to a number of people here that I remember when I gave my professorial address when I was made a professor at Waikato, that my family came in and I had 2 sisters who hadn't done too well at school. I remember they both said they at the end of the talk they were amazed to feel that it might have been the school or the system and not them. And I think that's the same sort of message that we heard today, which I think was particularly potent to me personally, but I'm sure to you as well. And anyone like me who come to the Pacific very quickly realises how important relationships and how family and community are. So again, I thought that resonated wonderfully with Pacific culture and Pacific peoples and their views of the world. I particularly like the quantitative and qualitative nature that you presented in your talk, because that's my a scientist and an education as well, and it's wonderful to see that blend of the two there, so particularly important there as well. And finally, just I think having read all of the portfolios of the Teaching Excellence Award winners, then what you said is totally evidenced in those portfolios, how you could see in those portfolios that our wonderful teachers here truly do very much the sort of thing, saying you could very strongly see the relationship between the teacher and the students and the lack of a deficit model and thinking there. So that's wonderful to see how that exists here, and our challenge, as you challenged us, Russell, was to see how we can try and embed that across the institution, that becomes part of our DNA, part of how we function in the university. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like you to join me in thanking Russell for that wonderful talk here.
You're very welcome.
We will have morning tea now, and instead of a normal Q&A session, and after morning tea we're going to have a session where some victims that we chose in advance have been listening to the talk and are now going to come as a panel, and then they will give their response to what Russell said, and at the end of that there'll be an opportunity for Russell to comment on that as well. So we'll have morning tea next. Sorry, Red?
Hey.
Wonderful.
Wonderful, thank you.
One quick question, okay, is there a microphone somewhere? Yep. Bearing in mind using the people's morning tea, but that's all right.
But after 45 years here, thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're lovely.
Wonderful. Just 2 questions.
Are the easy ones?
One.
How did you get to the top of the Spanish mountain, and do you speak Spanish?
I walked, and no.
And secondly,
That's three questions
One of the things that I haven't heard anything about is the actual kind of activities, whereas that facilitate this. And one thing that, like field trips or field work in the communities, which has been a hallmark for 30 years of USP's teaching until the last 10 years because of health and safety reasons and things, is that the recent regime has kind of kept us from going out to the communities and having them learn. And then the other is sports. Different, and you can interpret that any way you want in terms of how the school, and so the one thing I would say, you got to make the school a community. And it's things like sports and things like that that give a big school or something a set, and sometimes the coaches are also teachers, and they are the ones that establish the relationships, and then they may, in the high schools, also be the teachers. So just kind of a comment, kind of a question.
I won't take too long. That's chapter 8. Okay? Have a read. Get it. I gave Richard a copy of the book. It's chapter 8. It's in chapter 8. You're quite right. The school has to provide the context. The school leaders have got to do the same thing as this. They've got to create a learning context. They've got to interact with their staff and students in that way. And they've got to monitor what's going on. They've got to do the same things. And they've got to create around the learning teachers and so on, the context that they're expecting these teachers to do for their students. So the relationship at the student-teacher level has got to be the same at the leaders and so on level. It's got to be the same between the system levels. It's a cascade model. They've all got to be the same. A quick answer on how you do it. I referred briefly to cooperative learning. Again, in chapter 8 of the book, I've got an example. I went to Canada. I saw 2 young teachers engaged in teaching. One was having a terrible time, and after I visited, she was in tears. Wasn't to do with me. She was in tears because of she was going to leave teaching. It was the end of the year. She said, I've had enough. That's it. 1 year she was in teaching. She was out the door. She said it was terrible. I spoke to the school's system leaders. I said, what support are you providing for that young person? And they said, we're too busy dealing with discipline and administration. I then went to another school where a young woman, the same age, same level of proficiency, first year teaching, was absolutely engaged in learning and teaching and was having a great time, was going to stay on in teaching. And the reason was she was mentored and coached in a very close-knit environment where she was being supported. And they were using cooperative learning strategies. She was teaching in a way that you would not expect a first-year teacher to be teaching. And but because next door teacher was a 20-year veteran who was using this approach, and they planned and they worked it all together. You're absolutely right. I gave you once over lightly. But, I'm just saying that there is...
You have to buy the book, Randy, I think, is the answer.
Get that book.
Thank you very much. We'll have one in tea now. Thanks.
I better give that back.
Fantastic. Absolutely.
Oh, you're welcome.
I love it.
Thank you. Oh, God, there we go. Turn that off in case I say anything.